Hello, my name is Rene Cepeda. I am the curator at the New Media Caucasus Header Footer Gallery. I specialize in new media art and digital exhibitions, and I'm here today to talk to you about corporate prudishness and its effects on minority and alternative cultures, specifically in virtual exhibitions. So, first we have to define what is corporate prudishness. Corporate prudishness is the tendency by corporations to censor any content that they perceive may be badly received by the mainstream audience and therefore has to be reduced or eliminated in order to retain earnings. Examples of this include the Vienna Museum, where they, as a collective, had to move over their social media presence, specifically their nudes of their artworks or their collections, into OnlyFans because they were being removed by Facebook and they risked losing their accounts. In a form of protest, they did this. Now they have stopped doing that and they're back after claiming that the advances have been made. However, these are not completely true. Now, it also affects people like minority artists. It affects people who don't have as established a presence or reputation in the field. So things like Betty Thompson's Fog paintings from 1969 have been consistently been censored, removed, and her social media presence has been limited precisely because of these things. So this also highlights something, which is the inequality in censorship that we see. So the more famous one is, or the more reputable an institution is, the easier it is to get around a ban or even avoid censorship to begin with. Whereas minority creators are often censored, and only once an outcry happens, that's when their posts are uncensored or restated. Now, not only nudity is censored, we have seen that queer identities are very heavily policed, in terms that even things that would be acceptable when done by heterosexual, cis, heteronormative people are okay when it's presented as queer. In those cases, it becomes censorable. It's also affecting things like social movements. We've seen it with Black Lives Matter. We've seen it with anti-fascism, and all other kinds of movements that require a certain nuance. So things like defund police and things like that have been consistently been affected by these kinds of censorships, mostly under the guise of hate speech or things like that. Furthermore, we can see examples like for this, like when Pedro Almodovar's poster for his movie was censored by Instagram, and immediately after it was brought up to their attention, there was an official apology offered. So if you're Pedro Almodovar, that's fantastic. But if you're not him, then you're constantly fighting for this, as can be seen by Robert Andy Coombs, whose Instagram keeps getting censored and his body removed, banned, or considered too sensitive or explicit just because this is a queer disabled body, as Coombs puts it. So we can also see it in how Tumblr functions, where, as history has shown us, they tried to get rid of all adult content, and interestingly enough, that included anything that was LGBT community. It included anything that was seen as sexual. However, their filters still allow for white power, for white genocide, and all these terms and things are associated with the far right. So it is interesting what the moderation values of Tumblr are. But this affects everyone. The algorithms just replicate power structures anyhow. So how does this affect individuals? So first of all, it reduces an access to an audience. So if you are one of these subversive, and we're using this term generously, autists, you will have your audience reduced either by shadow banning or full banning, or by having your post removed. So this will affect everyone in the art world. It also limits outreach within institutions, because once an institution knows that you keep getting censored, they may be more reticent to accept your work. It also removes the ability to cooperate or share information, knowledge, and things like that with other creators, because they may be afraid of losing their own platform if they, say, retweet your shows or your work. So that's another effect. Then we have reduced fields of expression. That means basically that you're reduced in what you can talk about. You can't talk about social policy, you can talk about race theory, you can't talk about so many things because the algorithm and the corporations that institute it have deemed it unacceptable content. And we'll see examples of that later down. We also have this tendency to reward safe work. So we get a artwork that may be vacuous or not as significant simply because it's the safe thing to do. Portraits of cats, landscapes, all these kind of things. And finally, as a consequence of all this, you have reduced visibility and representation of minorities because they're considered dangerous in a way. So this reduces the field, and it reduces, furthermore, the effects that the social movements can have. So this is a very worrying trend that we're seeing now. Then we have the effects on institutions. They're similar but different at the same time. So museum and cultural institutions may implement self-censorship in fear of losing their accounts and the social media benefits that come from that, the access to publics, the free, well, not free, but cheaper marketing efforts, all these kind of things. Also, it makes certain topics taboo. So if you are queer, they may decide, well, no, this is too dangerous to show, so we're not going to do it. We've seen exhibitions keep constantly getting things pulled because politicians don't agree with it or a thing. And this is gonna get worse once we depend on corporations who don't have to follow certain rules. Then we have the reinforcement of the status quo. The heteronormative, cisgendered white narrative prevails because that's what's mainstream, at least in Western culture, and as hegemons of culture all around the world, they keep reinforcing this idea. Then we have a limitation in the inclusion of diverse artists and audiences. So that would be reducing what kind of people have access to these platforms, right? So if you know that you're going to get banned for being queer or gay or lesbian or whatever, any other identity, if you're going to get banned because you're Black and you're talking about the challenges of being Black or Mexican in my case or whatever, you start to self-censor yourself as well because you need to eat, right? Then we also have rising costs because to avoid this corporate censorship, you generally have to take certain measures that you would not have to do because solutions already existed and they're being taken away from you. And finally, museums, we have to be very, very aware of this. Museums can also be guilty of corporate prudishness. For example, when Pornhub tried to do its own interpretation on nudes and things, it wasn't the best. It wasn't done in the most delicate of ways. And Pornhub itself is problematic. However, this idea that they can control this information and where these works, some of which are allowed to be used for these kind of purposes, because they're not used as pornography. They weren't used, but they were simply talked about in terms of pornography. And they were still removed because it wasn't acceptable in terms of corporate accessibility. And then we have things like the issues for exhibitions, which is the interesting thing. Right now, if you want to do an online exhibition, the easiest and cheapest way to do it is by using one of many platforms, things like GlitchMe or ArtStep or Exhibit, or you can do it on Instagram. I've done exhibitions on Instagram. You can do exhibitions on Facebook in some ways. You could do something on Twitch and all these platforms. But the problem is that this prudishness that we are fighting and facing means that if you upset the wrong person or you show the wrong image, and generally, if you're showing anything nude or anything queer, you're going to get taken down immediately. Either someone reports you or just the self-moderation, the auto-moderation, systems will take it down. So how can we share this content? So that's one of the biggest issues. But the other issue as well is what are the costs this implies to us. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. So GlitchMe, for example, bans nudity, violence, and certain other things, some of which make sense, but at the same time, okay, what is nudity? Is it obscene? Is it not obscene? Is the birth of the world by Courbet acceptable? Is it not? Same thing with RStep. RStep is even worse. RStep and exhibits, their policies are don't share obscene content, but there's no definition of what obscene is. So the only arbiters for this is RStep themselves and the corporation or the group that runs RStep or exhibit. So anything they don't like or they feel pressured to not accept for some reason or another, maybe some venture capitalist or some funding that they have that they've been waiting, and they're told, like, if you don't remove this, you're going to lose it. Gone. Your exhibition is gone. And then, well, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, those border on draconic, and they're so inconsistent. We have seen how male presenting nipples are okay, female presenting nipples are not okay. Topless men is okay, topless women is not okay, even in places like New York where it's legal. So it's very random and very arbitrary how these things are enforced. And they tend to favor conservative point of view. And then, well, the cost, we'll talk a little bit more. So what are the alternatives? So first of all, you can remain low tech, right? Website, you do your own website, upload your own videos on your website, make sure you have storage. All these things can be done, but they require knowledge and time and effort as opposed to uploading it to YouTube, right? So the other alternative is to find websites and platforms that are not as draconic and that let you do this. So one of a few examples, Reddit, WordPress, Blogger, Newsgrounds, Mastodon, they're more lenient with their content policies, and you may find ways to use them. One of the cool or interesting things about new media curation, especially in the online space, is that you don't have to bound yourself with what's traditional. This is a brand new world. We can try and do an experiment. So the biggest challenge, however, is how do we bring people to these platforms, right? And then there's also, well, okay, so I can't use, let's say, Glitch Me. So what can I do? Well, things like Unreal Engine or Second Life could be alternatives that you could use to generate your content. Obviously, this requires training. It's not as daunting as it sounds as long as you keep it simple. This is what I do. And then you can just use more traditional channels like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram to promote the show. Obviously, in a more censored way. But at the same time, this should not be new. You couldn't do nudity in posters in public generally. In certain places you can, but not everywhere. So you can adjust to these things and just find alternatives to draw people to these places. But one of the things you have to keep in mind is make sure there's no barriers of entry, meaning make sure your content is accessible, that it's available without having to create an account. In the case of, for example, the Vienna, nobody wants to create an OnlyFans account if they don't feel compelled to. And that's a problem because you had to register and then subscribe, and this goes into like your internet history in a way. So be careful with those things. Make sure that you are the most accessible. If I was asked what would I do right now, is WordPress or traditional hosting, creating my own websites using HTML coding, CSS. They're not that difficult, especially for more simple things. And even then, the cost for an online exhibition, while they can be lower than the traditional one, you should probably be budgeting about 2/3, I would say. You can go lower, but then you're having to improvise. And yeah, so in a way, what we're looking at, what we're trying to do here is find ways around the censorship by avoiding the large corporations and groups that may have issues. When you're dealing with smaller companies, you may actually be able to talk to someone and say, hey, I want to do this. Is this acceptable? If it's not, why is it not? And then maybe you can get some sort of agreement. If you can't, what I would recommend is go low tech and find creative alternatives. We have always thrived under limits, so I think that's one of the best sources for inspiration. The limitations and how we use these new technologies and platforms. Well, that is all. Thank you very much.